Well, you found your dream ministry position, pastor of a good, active church located in a nice beach community in North Carolina. Your wife and kids, they love it, they fit in well, and then you see the news. It's all over Facebook. Hurricane Mark is coming. It's just a Category 2. You don't need to leave. You're excited. It's your first hurricane. But as it gets closer and closer, the excitement begins to feel a little bit like fear. You know you should do something, but you don't know what to do first. Do you gas the vehicles, go out and get a couple of cases of bottled water, food that doesn't need to be cooked, batteries for the flashlights? I mean, the list goes on. And the storm is getting closer and closer. You've got all these ideas, but you don't do anything. Your fear has paralyzed you. And then you decide, I don't need to do all that stuff. Not a good decision. The storm hits, there is no power, no water for a week. And your supplies, they're gone in 4 days. You're sitting at the kitchen table wondering, what are you going to do? And then you look over at your wife and you notice the look on her face. You've let her down. You are embarrassed. You're ashamed. You knew the storm was coming. You knew the likely consequences, and yet you chose not to get prepared. That's Hurricane Mark. That's one type of storm. But there's another storm coming your way. This storm is much more likely to hit, and its consequences are much more devastating. This time, Mark is not a hurricane. Mark is an elder in your church, and he is abusing his wife. Domestic abuse, domestic violence is not a once-in-a-lifetime event. It happens regularly. I bet you've seen the headlines in the news the past couple of weeks. The NFL can't escape its domestic violence failures. Now, we kind of expect with those guys, right? The aggression on the field, the entitled lifestyle, but in my church, among my people, yeah, it's not a problem just out there. It's a problem in here, in our church family. 83% of pastors counsel an abused woman every single year. Almost 1 in 10 counsel 5 women every year. If you look at all women, 37% at some time experience domestic violence at the hands of an intimate partner, not some stranger, an intimate partner. And yet the clergy, they rank near the bottom of the barrel of people in whom these women will confide if they don't feel safe. In one survey, only 7% said that they would tell their pastor. Now, if you're in that 7%, how do you avoid being paralyzed by fear when the storm of Mark's domestic violence strikes your ministry? How do you lower the chance of making poor decisions? How do you avoid the shame of messing up, of potentially making a bad situation even worse? Well, this afternoon we'll look at how we answer that question. In doing so, we will look at the violation that domestic violence is. We will look at God's response, then we'll consider our response. The violation, God's response, and our response. We'll do this by looking at 3 texts. The first one is Psalm 55. So turn to Psalm 55, if you will. We'll be looking at verses 20 and 21. Domestic violence is an intentional covenant violation involving an abuse of authority. An intentional covenant violation involving an abuse of authority. Now, Psalm 55, it's one of the lament psalms. And many times in these psalms, we come across an enemy who causes a crisis of some sort. The betrayal here, though, is not by an enemy. It's by a close friend. Now, domestic violence is not specifically addressed in this passage, at least not the way we're considering it, but by an appropriate implication, we can get a picture of the nature of the violation that domestic violence represents. Look with me at verse 20. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. he violated his covenant. Notice who's doing this. My companion, a friend. The victim has a covenant with the perpetrator. Now, whether that's an actual covenant or if it's just a metaphor that signals that there is a relationship of mutual commitment, the important thing is that there is a relationship. There's a commitment to one another. There is trust, at least, until the perpetrator violates the covenant and destroys the trust. Look with me at verse 21, and we'll begin to get a picture of what the nature of the violation is. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Are you picking up on the hypocrisy, the duplicity of this here? Speech, smooth as butter, yet there's war in that heart. Words, softer than oil, yet they're like drawn swords. I mean, he's prepared for battle. Not just duplicity, this is intentional. He wants to do this. Now, if you turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 Peter 3, verse 7, we'll get a little deeper picture of what the nature of this violation is. As you turn, let me set the stage. This letter is sent to Christians who are facing persecution. And in the first two chapters, Peter describes explains to his readers their identity as God's people. And because they have that identity, they're called to be holy like he is. And they're expected to give out grace like he does. In the first part of chapter 3, he pictures how this would look inside a Christian marriage. The first 6 verses are addressed to the wives. The 7th verse, our verse, is addressed to the husbands. And what we see here is a picture of what it looks like when the husband exercises his authority in the marriage in an appropriate way. Look what Peter says in the first part of the verse. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Literally, live with them according to knowledge, is what the Greek says. That's knowledge of God and his ways, and knowledge of his wife. Knowing what her needs are, what her hopes are, knowing what will bring her up and what will tear her down. Knowing the delicacy of her nature and her feelings. He continues in the second part of the verse. Showing honor or respect to the woman as the weaker vessel. Now, he's not suggesting that somehow women are inferior to men. No, he knows what we know is that in general, the wives tend to be weaker physically than their husbands. That's not always the case, but frequently it is. And notice that he says that the husband owes respect to his wife, not despite the fact that she's weaker physically, but because that's what she's owed. And why is that? Well, he tells us in the third part. Because they are heirs with you of the grace of life. Now, we can understand the grace of life a couple of ways. One is that the husband and wife, they share in God's grace. Another way is that they are both recipients of the gift of eternal life. I think both understandings fit the context. The important thing here, the implication for us, is that when the husband does not treat his wife in this way, then he is abusing his authority as the head of the household. And so what we see in Psalm 55 and 1 Peter 3 is that domestic violence is a covenant violation, and it reveals that the man's heart has been turned away from God and his ways. In Psalm 55, we see that the woman has been violated by someone who is a close friend, who is trusted. And the perpetrator does this intentionally, right? He makes like on the outside that things are fine, but there's war in that heart. And that's not the way it should be. When two people are in a relationship and they're committed to the mutual good of one another. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, we see what this looks like in a Christian marriage. We see what it looks like when the man exercises that authority in a godly way. He needs to do it in a way that is considerate of his wife and is respectful of his wife. And if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't treat her like she is a co-heir of God's grace, then he is abusing that authority. And we see that this is intentional. It's done on purpose. Because of that, it's not just a spur of the moment. I couldn't help myself because something happened. No, it's premeditated. That reveals a problem with his heart, a heart that is turned away from God and his ways. Just like back then, we see the same thing today. If a man in a marriage, if he is walking with God and he has his heart turned towards God and his ways, he will do things the right way. He will use his authority, taking consideration and respecting his wife. But if his heart is turned away from God, he will abuse that very same authority. We've seen the violation of domestic violence. Let's look at God's response. Keep your finger in 1 Peter 3 and turn to Proverbs 3. Proverbs chapter 3. We'll look at verses 31 through 33. And God's response, God detests domestic violence and disciplines the abuser. In Proverbs chapter 3, the writer in the first 10 verses cautions the reader not to trust in their own wisdom, but rather to trust that God's way is the best way. And he points out that God takes care of those who walk with him, but opposes those who don't. In verses 21 through 35, he describes what this looks like as you interact with a neighbor. Now, domestic violence is not specifically addressed, but again, by legitimate implication, we really get to see just how devastating domestic violence really is. Look with me at these verses, 31 through 33, and we'll see a description of the perpetrator, the man who was walking in his own way. Verse 31, he's a man of violence. Verse 32, a devious person. Are you picking up echoes of Psalm 55? Verse 33, the house of the wicked. And we're told not to envy this guy who's getting his own way. He's getting it his own way in the marriage because he's coercing his wife, like we see with domestic violence. And why don't envy him? Look at verse 32. This is an abomination to the Lord. God detests this. And look at the result. Verse 33. The Lord's curse is on this man's house. Now, this does not mean that God literally curses the guy's actual house. What it means is that God is withdrawing his benevolent, life-giving presence to all that the man holds dear. He's removing his blessing from the guy's life, his possessions, his security, even his very family. And for a picture of how this actually works out, let's go back to 1 Peter 3, verse 7. Remember, Peter is telling the husbands to treat their wives the right way, using their authority the right way. Why? Look at the last part of the verse. So that your prayers may not be hindered. This is a warning that if the man abuses his authority in that marital relationship, that God may well not answer his prayers. What we see here and in Proverbs 3 is just how devastating domestic violence is. Not only is there the violence and the harm to relationship between the man and the woman, but there's harm to relationship between the man and God. God detests domestic violence. He abhors this abuse of authority in that relationship where we draw two people and made them one. And so he disciplines the abuser. He withdraws his hand of blessing, and one way that looks is that God will refuse to answer his prayers. In essence, he's cutting off his relationship with that man. And so part of the totality of the devastation with domestic violence is not just the human consequences. Now we're getting a picture here of the divine spiritual consequences. And just like back then, God still hates domestic violence today, and he will discipline the abuser. So we've seen the violation of domestic violence. We've seen God's response. Well, how should you respond? Prepare to deal with domestic violence when it occurs in your ministry. There is so much domestic violence in our culture, and as we've seen, it's not just out there, it's in our church family. And as we've seen, that the man who abuses, he knows how to talk the good talk. He may be your fishing buddy. He may be the coach of your daughter's soccer team. He may be the chairman of your elder board. You're inclined to believe him anyway. But on top of that, he is devious. He is deceiving. He talks well, but there is war in that heart. And so the first you learn of this, maybe you get the phone call in the middle of the night. The police, they're at Mark and Susan's place, and she's been taken to the hospital. How do you avoid being paralyzed by fear when that storm strikes your ministry? How do you avoid the shame of making bad decisions when this happens? And it's going to happen, as these statistics show. Be prepared to deal with domestic violence. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to suggest to you 4 ways you can get prepared right now. I'll give you a handout to supplement what I'm going to go over with you. But the first way, it sounds a little weird, but not so much if you think about it. Humbly accept your own limitations. You're excellent observers of people, yet so often you don't see this coming. Not until it hits. And as we saw, this is a matter of the heart. A heart turned away from God, and so your counseling by itself may not go anywhere, may not effect real change in these lives. So you need to humbly accept that the fight belongs to the Lord. Yes, pray, love your people, do what you can. But in the end, the fight belongs to God. He's the only one that can transform hearts. Second of all, get well educated on the nature and on the risk factors for domestic violence. A book I highly recommend as a starting point is this one. It's called The Heart of Domestic Abuse: Gospel Solutions for Men Who Use Control and Violence in the Home. This will be on the handout. The third thing is come up with a plan for how you're going to provide pastoral care to both the abused and to the abuser. They both need it. Of 1,000 churches surveyed, only about half had safety plans worked out. Make sure your church is in the good 50%. A critical first step at providing good pastoral care in a situation like this is to ensure the safety and the protection of the woman and her children. For example, know where there's a shelter or a safe house where she and her children can go that the husband won't know about. If this is an ongoing thing and she's chosen not to leave yet, well, that may change any time. So make sure that she has a safety kind of go kit packed up, ready to go, hidden somewhere. Change of clothes, toiletries, some cash, copies of important documents. And then think in advance of how you could provide good pastoral care to both sides of the equation. They both need it. And then what are you going to do about church discipline? Think about it in advance before it comes. And the fourth thing, the last thing, is to become aware of the availability and how to access local domestic violence resources and their providers. So know about the 24-hour crisis hotline that can be called. Know about the shelters or the safe houses. Know about the counseling for the abused woman and the social services that can help out. Know about the intervention programs for the abuser. And because so often alcohol and drugs are mixed up in this whole mess, know about the drug and alcohol rehab and treatment facilities that are available. So prepare yourself with these steps, and then each time you move on to a new ministry, update the information. So you've seen the problem of domestic abuse, that it is a covenant violation involving an abuse of authority. You've seen the results, not only the human consequences, but the spiritual consequences. So my challenge this week is that you prepare to deal with domestic violence. Don't be the pastor who thinks that this is just an anger management problem, or the one who thinks that it's a legal issue and that throwing the guy in jail is going to make him change, or that this is just a couple relationship problem, and that your counseling is going to somehow get rid of this. It's not going to work, at least not by itself. I want you to succeed and provide great care for your people. So do these things. Make use of this handout. Thank you.
Thank you.